Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Monster Report. Your host Nick Adam Poling here. Monster Report's a show highlighting those entertaining creatures of film history. I am joined via Skype with Mr. Brett Homenick and Erik Homenick, the Homenick duo. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. It's good to be back, actually.
Yes, and premiering for his first time on the Monster Report is Brett. Brett is in Tokyo, Japan. Erik is in San Diego, and here I am in Indiana bringing this conversation together to talk about Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah and our reactions to the film, cast and characters, music. Erik, of course, being the webmaster for the English language akirafukabe.org, correct?
.org.
Yes, and definitely check that out for some great information. Brett writes for VantagePointInterviews.com. In fact, he is the owner of VantagePointInterviews.com. Check that out. In fact, what's very cool is if you ever do a Google image search, a lot of times for the cast members of any of the cast members or crew of any of the Heisei and Showa Godzilla films, Millennium films, you'll likely see a great picture of a picture that makes me very jealous of Brett.
You'll likely see them elsewhere too.
Yes.
There you go.
Yeah. So Brett's had the chance to meet a lot of these just legendary actors and crewmen, crew people from the Godzilla series and other films, and it's great to have you both on this episode. So. 1991, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Of course, the Heisei series of films were not being released in the United States. We may have heard about some of these films that were being created in Japan, but home video release in the States was just not happening, actually. And so we'll get to maybe an interesting story about how maybe these gentlemen got to see a version of it when we were all clamoring and waiting to get just a glimpse of these films. But either one of you gentlemen, actually, talking about the cast and characters of this film, of course, we've got a new era, of course, the Heisei era. We are bringing in some actors and actresses from the Showa series. And we've got our first recurring character, of course, in the Heisei series in Miki Sagusa. And so just talk about any of the cast characters, crew, suit actors, and tell me some interesting stories about them or some reactions to any of the characters that are in this film.
All right, well, I guess I can get started there. When it comes to the characters, of course, we have many actors, and as you said, a lot of them came from the old days. We have folks like Kenji Sahara, who has a relatively small part here, but he was in 13 Godzilla films going all the way back to the original in a small part.
That's right. Yeah,
we also have Akiji Kobayashi, and I'll have more to say about him in just a moment, but he, of course, played the captain character in the original Ultraman, and he was also a regular on the original Kamen Rider series, which was a monster hit at the time in Japan, and of course he was a very well-known television presence, and he's in this movie as well as Godzilla vs. Mothra later on. Also in here, speaking of Ultraman, is, I hope I can pronounce the name correctly. I always mess this one up, but I guess the Western pronunciation would be Susumu Kurobe, who of course played Shin Hayata in the original Ultraman, and he's also in King Ghidorah as well. Now, when we're talking about the principal cast, of course, we have to talk about first Anna Nakagawa, who is the leading lady of the story and in many ways the heart and soul of the entire production. And I had a chance, of course, to interview her back in 2012, and she was very happy to share her memories, and she had a lot of very interesting things to say. Also, among the other cast, too, we have Terasawa, the character of Terasawa, played by Kosuke Toyohara. And actually, he's someone that I don't really have a lot of comments on in terms of anything. I've never had a chance to speak with him about the film, never had a chance even to meet him. in any way, and so I don't really know much about his career, don't really have very much to say about him, despite the fact that he's the leading actor of the film. And then, of course, we have Megumi Adaka, who returns to this film as Miki Saigusa, of course, the celebrated psychic character. And, she, of course, if anybody thinks about the Heisei series in general, they probably think about Megumi Adaka or Miki Saigusa. And her presence is certainly felt in this film as well. And rounding out the supporting cast is, of course, Katsuhiko Sasaki, who we all remember as the leading actor from Godzilla vs. Megalon, as well as Terror of Mechagodzilla. So he returns to the Heisei series here, along with Biollante. He was in that film as well. And then, of course, I think the last person, last but not least, as they say, should be Yoshio Tsuchiya, who probably nobody has ever uttered a single negative word about. Everybody highly respects this actor, one of the most celebrated actors in Japan, worked with Akira Kurosawa on numerous films over the years, and was a wonderful actor and certainly added a lot to this film as well, giving it a lot of credibility and a lot of emotional edge. So I think those are probably some of the cast members that we'll talk about coming up in this program, and those are the ones that I think most people would think about when they think about this film. And I don't know if Erik would like to add anything, or if Nick, if you would like to add anything, but feel free to do so.
Just one thing, and then maybe Erik jumping in. I was, definitely taking a lot of note of Yoshio Tsuchiya, going way back even to Seven Samurai, Akira Kurosawa. Recently looked at the film again, just because it's just such a magnificent film, of course, and seeing how much of Tsuchiya's character is actually in that, and how much just emotional he is pouring into that character. And he's always picked these roles in the Godzilla series and the kaiju genre in general, of just off the wall characters, some that are just on the edge of losing their mind sometimes, and I think that he embraces those characters. But I'm sure, you'll talk a little about that as well. But that's one of the actors in just all of the films that I've seen from Japan, whether they be Kurosawa films or kaiju films, that really does stand out to me. That I'm like, I always kind of look for the odd birds, and I always say that he belongs in that category, because even a role like in the Mysterians where he's behind a mask, and that didn't faze him to say, this is actors, they like to see their faces on the screen, and here's a role that doesn't allow for that, and that didn't really bother him. He embraced that role, and I think that's just one of the the great things about these actors actually jumping into the characters. But go ahead, Erik. Anything about the cast and characters or crew?
Nothing to the amount of detail Brett is going to go into, but I think that in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah there are some great moments, and we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end, especially when we talk about our own personal feelings. I think, Yoshio Tsuchiya, his Shindo character is, for me, the most compelling character of the film, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, but that scene where he and Godzilla are sort of staring each other down before Godzilla kills him is a tremendously well done scene. It's but we'll talk a little bit about that later. And also, I think Mecha King Ghidorah is an iconic monster. I think that both monsters, Godzilla and King Ghidorah, both look great in the film, and Mecha King Ghidorah is just very well executed. He looks great. Great design. I think it's one of the master strokes of Koichi Kawakita and company in terms of monster design. Very, very well done.
Yes.
Definitely one of the most iconic monsters of the Heisei series, and perhaps of the entire Godzilla series. It's a very, very well done monster. But we'll talk a little bit about all that stuff later. And of course, the music, which
Yes.
I'll have quite a bit to say about.
Yeah, very much looking forward to that as well. And yeah, we can't forget, our suit actors. Kenpachiro Satsuma, of course, as Godzilla through the Heisei series, and of course the Mecha King Ghidorah, Hurricane Ryu, Hurricane. I don't know, Brett. I guess we didn't talk about that earlier, but did you have any encounters with the suit actors as you were going through some of your interviews?
I have, of course, met Mr. Satsuma and Mr. Ryu on a couple of occasions. I never really had a chance to speak with them specifically about this film, so I don't really have any particularly interesting stories from them about the making of the film. But actually, going back to Mr. Tsuchi, I do have a quick story to tell, not necessarily about this film, but I did have a chance to meet him in December of 2015, just about a little bit more than a year before he passed away, and he told me an interesting story about his early life, which I thought was kind of interesting. He was from Yamanashi Prefecture, which is an area near Mount Fuji, and he was born in 1927. So when he was, becoming a young man and he was growing up, this is during the time of World War II. And, of course, Tokyo was being bombed by American forces, and it was a very dangerous place to be. So a lot of actors from Tokyo fled the city and would go to Yamanashi Prefecture. And so it was during that time that Mr. Tsuchiya had a chance to talk to a lot of actors who came from Tokyo, which, of course, was an entertainment center in Japan at the time. And he got a chance to talk to them about acting and became familiar with them and probably got some advice from them about becoming an actor. So that's sort of what I thought an interesting little side story there about his early life. But yes, to go back to the point about the suit actors, I don't have much to add, but perhaps we should talk about the man at the top of the food chain when it comes to Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and that's none other than Kazuki Omori. Yes. Now, there's an interesting bit of trivia about Mr. Omori and sort of his entry into the Godzilla series. There's something that separates him from all the other directors that came before him, every one of them. Do either of you have any guess as to what that thing is?
He was not an assistant director.
And he was also not a Toho employee.
Okay.
So he did not come from, he was not brought up through the studio system. He was the first freelancer who came to the Godzilla series. So every other director, whether it's Yoshimitsu Banno, Motoyoshi Oda, even Koji Hashimoto, the 84 director, they all came up through the Toho studio system, and they all trained in that system. Kazuki Omori was the first time that Toho relied on a freelancer to handle the Godzilla series, so I think that was quite an interesting thing. According to an interview that I did with Mr. Omori back in 2006, he credits a Godzilla fan club in Osaka as being his entry into the Godzilla series. According to him, Mr. Tomiyuki Tanaka, the producer of the Godzilla series, had some connections and had some friendships in this fan club, and apparently some of these people recommended that Omori direct the next one. They told him, if you really want to do something new, something innovative, you have to rely on Mr. Omori, and that is essentially how he got the job for Biollante. So I'm going to have to now turn to my notes here. I've got some notes that I took during my conversations with Mr. Omori and some of the others, and I'll give you some details about what he said. Some of these will also have to do with Biollante because, of course, he worked on that from the beginning, and I would like to throw in some of those comments as well. So in late October, I had a chance to talk to him over the course of a couple of days and ask him some questions, and so I'll just sort of get into the things that he told me at the time. One of the questions I asked him was who he thought was the best actor in either Godzilla vs. Biollante or Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and of course, it's a pretty easy answer. We can all guess Yoshio Tsuchiya was the best actor that he worked with in either film. An interesting point, and maybe I will sort of talk about a couple of things here now that I see this in my notes. Dorats. Of course, we all are familiar with the Dorats. We all have our opinions about them. And I've got 3 things to talk about as it relates to the Dorats. And then, of course, I'll turn it over to you guys for your feedback. I had a chance to ask Mr. Omori, Dorats, Why?
Right.
Why? I never liked the story. I never liked that origin story. The one thing I liked King Ghidorah as a movie, but I hated the origin stories for both Godzilla and Ghidorah in this film. So I asked him why, and he kind of smiled. He thought about it, and in English, he told me, "Mistake."
Okay.
Mistake. So there you go. I don't think that's ever been reported anywhere else, but I think Mr. Omori kind of regrets the Dorats. Now, let's talk about two actresses and their reaction to the Dorats. As I mentioned earlier, I had a chance to interview Anna Nakagawa in 2012, and the topic of the Dorats was brought up. She actually, as a present, brought me a pack of bromide cards from Cast Company. Bromide cards are about the size of 3x5 cards, and Cast Company produces these, and they're usually basically Toho publicity stills reproduced with some like little borders or some little added designs. Maybe it says Gojira Tai King Ghidorah on the bottom of it and so forth. And the Dorats, a picture of her with the Dorats was on that. So she was looking at this particular picture, and she looked at it and she said, "Cute." And she also said that even though a lot of people didn't like the Dorats, she actually really did like them. So she told me that she was a fan of the Dorats and was perfectly happy with them, thought they were cute. An interesting thing also about the Dorats, which I'm not sure people really have picked up on this in the film, in the scene where it's sort of like a close-up of her face, or her maybe a bust-up shot, and there's sort of Dorats flying around her, and there's like maybe a Dorat here and a Dorat here. These are being puppeted, of course, off-screen by Toho puppeteers. There's one that's about right here, kind of under her face. She herself is manipulating it by kind of going like this.
Really?
If you can see my fingers. So that's her puppeting the Dorats in those scenes. I don't know if anyone's ever picked up on that, but that's what she was doing in those scenes. Now, another actress, Megumi Odaka. What does she think about the Dorats? She hated the Dorats. Hated them. She thought they looked like something from a horror movie. Absolutely, just hated them. So in the movie, when you see her reaction, she says "kawaii" or "cute," and she, acts like she's really. That's pure acting on her part. Pure acting. She thought they were just like something from a horror movie, like just kind of disgusting and not a very cute thing at all. So there you have three different reactions to the Dorats from the cast and crew. The person who actually created the Dorats in terms of the writing, and also some of the cast who worked with them.
Nakagawa should have been given some, a little extra in the paycheck, or at least a credit for assistant puppeteer, right?
Yes, an added credit. I think that would have been appropriate, but of course, oftentimes with Toho, that's the way it goes.
Yeah, but interesting stories there, and of course we've you were mentioning earlier the late Yoshio Tsuchiya, and to keep in mind also the late Anna Nakagawa, who we've lost recently, and so sharing those stories is very invaluable. And you personally meeting them, even a story just about her considering the Dorats cute. I just find that just really interesting how that all played out, whether they had an opinion on it or not, whether they just treated this as a job, just another job or not. And no, they really do pour themselves into those roles, which is great. I was going to ask you if you had any interactions with kind of the international cast, because we've also got Wilson, Gunchiko, we've got a lot of them that were added to this, and I imagine, language barriers and all of that, bringing them into this film. Talk a little about the international cast, if you would.
Sure, and yes, I have had a lot of interaction with them. I've actually been able to meet a lot of them in person, and I've interviewed quite a lot of them directly as well. Aside really from maybe Chuck Wilson and Richard Berger, who of course were the Futurians in the film, a lot of the other actors, of course, didn't have really a lot to say because their scenes were quite small. So there isn't a lot of interesting material to go into when it comes to their experiences. They enjoyed making the film, but other than that, it was pretty much what you would expect, their scenes to be like. But Richard Berger is a very he played Gren Chico, the Futurian. Very, very nice person. I've hung out with him several times. Actually, maybe about a year ago, on a train platform, I recognized him. He was just there, and as it sometimes happens when you live in Japan. And I went up to him and said, "Hey, how's it going? What's up?" And so we had a short conversation. He had to go to the library to pick out a book that he needed for some reason. And so as I kind of walked along with him. We were talking about different stuff, talking about life in general. And so yeah, that happened. I ran into him, and but now he's totally out of the entertainment industry. He works. He works in a large company now. And he's a very busy guy doing a lot. Of course, anyone who works in a large company in Japan is a very busy person, doesn't have a lot of free time for socializing or anything like that. So he's, got his family, but lives a very normal life now. But again, very, very intelligent person, very nice. Chuck Wilson, I actually have never met Chuck Wilson, but I did interview him via email about 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago. And he was very businesslike. And he has an aura, even through writing, that you don't want to mess with this guy. He's a very strong person. Somebody who was familiar with Chuck Wilson told me that he actually was a judo trainer for the police in Japan. So he's very involved in judo. That's why he came to Japan in the first place. So he kind of had that aura of, you don't want to make him angry. You don't want to do the wrong thing around him because perhaps, he might get upset, and you wouldn't like him when he's angry, very much like the Incredible Hulk. And again, he did kind of have that aura even in writing, but he's from Boston. He was born in Boston, and he grew up in Michigan, or at least I think he was educated in Michigan, and then came to Japan in 1970, largely for judo pursuits. And even when, at the time of King Ghidorah, Megumi Odaka has told me that he couldn't speak Japanese really, and so they didn't talk at all. Now, I don't know if he did all of his lines phonetically or what he did, because obviously he's speaking Japanese in the movie. But according to Megumi Odaka, he didn't really speak Japanese at all. So I'm not sure. Maybe she didn't have a chance to really talk to him personally and just got the impression that he couldn't speak Japanese. I'm not sure, but when you see the film, he's obviously speaking Japanese. And of course, Richard Berger was also brand new to Japan at the time. He hadn't been there for that long, so I think he also wasn't as fluent in Japanese as he became later, because of course now he's fluent and speaks Japanese very well. But they're both, at least Richard Berger is a very nice person. I'm in touch with him, but of course, he's a very busy person, so I don't have much of a chance to get to see him. Kent Gilbert, the ship commander in the World War II scenes.
Yeah.
People may not actually know this, but he, out of the entire sort of American cast, is actually the best known celebrity in Japan when it comes to all of these actors. He's actually still very relevant in Japan as a commentator. And he often comments on the news and so forth, political news in Japan and America. If you go into a Japanese bookstore, even to this day, you'll see his face on books because he's very, very active, very prolific as a commentator, and pretty much everybody knows who he is in Japan.
Does he speak Japanese? He must speak Japanese.
Absolutely. He speaks and writes Japanese, and he's from Utah. He's a Mormon, and just to give you a little bit of a background of who he is and what he's like. But he's a lawyer as well, and again, very intelligent guy, very soft spoken, and filmed his scenes in Yokosuka. So if anyone is familiar with Yokosuka, sort of in Kanagawa Prefecture, where there's like a lot of military ships anyway from the U.S. That's where those scenes were shot. And, of course, you have Daniel Call there. He was Major Spielberg. And another nice guy I was able to meet. And he's fairly well known, although I think perhaps like his heyday is a little bit past. But, his specialty now is talking about the Fukushima disaster. Because he's actually, he has a lot of ties to Yamagata Prefecture, which is a little bit close to Fukushima. So I think he was personally, not necessarily affected, but I think he's personally interested in what happened in Fukushima. So he wants to kind of raise awareness and to sort of dispel some of perhaps the rumor and innuendo that there's like it's a disaster area, it's dangerous, and people should flee there. He wants to sort of calm people down and basically help improve Fukushima, make sure that people don't fear it, that make sure that people understand that it's a safe place to go, that's getting better, and the people there need help. So he's very involved in sort of raising awareness when it comes to the disaster in Fukushima, even to this day. So yeah, I mean, I've had the upper end. Of course, there's also Take That, You Dinosaur. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name now, and I just actually met him for the first time just a couple of weeks ago. It'll come Jeff Berglund. Thank you very much, Jeff Berglund, and he lives in Kyoto, originally from South Dakota. Occasionally, he'll commute to Japan. He'll commute to Tokyo from Kyoto, and he's like a Kyoto specialist, and he promotes Kyoto, is real involved in sort of like Kyoto tourism and so forth. A very nice guy, very friendly, and I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to meet him. It's funny, I went to an event where he was with a lot of other Japanese people, and it was sort of like a Kyoto event where he was sort of doing activities and so forth, and a lot of it was very Kyoto-centric. And at the very end of the event, I went up to him and shook his hand. And, he didn't recognize me at first. And then I mentioned King Ghidorah, and he said, no, I'll think of it. I know your name. And then after a while, it took him a couple of seconds, and then he remembered my name, and it was like, yes, that's who I am. That's exactly who I am. So very nice guy. But yes, I've gotten to know the cast quite well. I probably, out of all of them, I probably got to know Richard Berger the best. And he's, again, a very nice guy, very, very intelligent, and, very normal, down-to-earth guy. So I like him a lot. Very, very nice.
What's interesting is that, meeting them on a train like that, finding these actors and actresses that are very approachable, that they don't, they don't treat it like, I'm, a different class of citizen than you, that they give you the time to speak with you, hang out with you like you did, and, even if they had time to give you an interview, and that's just really great to see. And, one of the, people I got to meet in my first G-Fest, was the visual effects director Koichi Kawakita, and also another late great, unseen in so many ways, because of course visual effects directors, they're not on screen, so they, but what they are doing, their work is of course crucially important to these films, and Kawakita, of course, filling the shoes, beginning with Eiji Tsuburaya, taking on the visual effects of this film, and of course, prior to this, Biollante, and throughout the rest of the Heisei series. Do you have any kind of stories, specifically maybe related to the 91 Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah with Koichi Kawakita, or visual effects in general?
Well, actually, I don't have King Ghidorah, but I do have a couple of things about Biollante, the other Omori movie, that I think are quite interesting. And again, maybe these stories are out there, maybe not, but I think they're worth sharing. This came from Kazuki Omori. He's the source of this. But actually, apparently, you may know about the story contest for Godzilla vs. Biollante. And so there are a lot of ideas being submitted for that. And actually, one of the people who submitted a screenplay was Koichi Kawakita himself. Okay. And Tanaka looked at the screenplay and was like, no, we're not filming this. This is because apparently it had a lot of quote-unquote Kawakita scenes, special effects scenes. So it was very much like, maybe like it came across perhaps like a promo reel for Koichi Kawakita's special effects. Apparently it was very special effects heavy. This comes from Kazuki Omori. So, but apparently he submitted his own screenplay for Godzilla vs. Biollante, like a full screenplay apparently, but Tanaka rejected it because it had too many Kawakita scenes, as it were. Another thing about special effects, perhaps not like, perhaps a little bit more on the suit building side, comes from Fuyuki Shinada. Fuyuki Shinada is a suit builder. He built Biollante, and he also built Godzillasaurus in both films. And during the making of Biollante, he had a conversation with Koichi Kawakita, And Shinada asked Kawakita, what should we do for the new Godzilla? What should it be like? What are we going to do? And Kawakita told him that he took an idea from Kobayashi's script. Kobayashi, of course, was the dentist who, of course, is credited with coming up with the DNA idea that Kazuki Omori used for his own screenplay. So he took an idea about Godzilla's teeth. Of course, Kobayashi, being a dentist, he paid a lot of attention to the teeth of Godzilla. So if you ever wanted to know why Godzilla has 2 rows of teeth, it's the dentist's idea. Yep. So Kawakita, took that dentist idea and incorporated it to Godzilla's mouth. Now, there's also more ideas, because apparently Kobayashi really got into the whole mouth aspect of Godzilla and really wanted to flesh out a lot of the details. So I guess one idea, and I don't think this ever made it into a movie, but according to Fuyuki Shinada, this is something that Kawakita told him, or it's something that Shinada knows firsthand, is that if one of Godzilla's teeth breaks, a new one will grow back.
Okay.
So there you go. Like another little small detail. So that's, again, only a dentist could come up with these ideas.
Right.
Another thing, too, I guess if you look at, I've never really paid this kind of attention, but I guess if you look in the movies pre-Biollante inside Godzilla's mouth, it's a very smooth and flat surface. Well, again, it was, I guess, Kobayashi's idea to include like a lot of folds and a lot of details and a lot of character inside the mouth. So I guess if you go back, I haven't done this, of course, but if you go back and look inside Godzilla's mouth pre-Biollante, you won't see very much detail. But from Biollante on, apparently there's a lot of folds, a lot of character, a lot of things going on there. It's not just smooth, and apparently that came from Kobayashi's script, and Kawakita liked those ideas and incorporated them into the new Godzilla. Also, when it comes to Godzillasaurus, going back to King Ghidorah, I had a chance because Shinada actually built the suit, and I asked him what sort of inspiration did he have for the Godzillasaurus suit, and he was inspired by a Czech dinosaur artist by the name of Zdeněk Burian, who you may know if you're into dinosaurs. He painted a lot of dinosaur illustrations. And there's a lot of history here with this particular artist. I didn't know this, but according to Fuyuki Shinada, actually Teizo Toshimitsu, who built the original Godzilla suit, also relied on this Belgian artist, Belgian or Czech. I think he was born in Belgium, but was technically...
His name sounds Czech.
Yeah, so anyway, I don't know much about him. But apparently Teizo Toshimitsu took his artistry or his illustrations for the T-Rex, use that for Godzilla's face. I'm talking about Godzilla 54, by the way. Yeah. Use that for his face. The spines were from the Stegosaurus, which we all know. If we've seen King Kong versus Godzilla, we already knew that. But Godzilla's stance, this thing right here, was apparently taken from his illustrations of Iguanodon. So apparently Teizo Toshimitsu took those 3 illustrations and sort of mixed them together and created the original Godzilla from those illustrations. And Fuyuki Shinada went back to the same artist and basically used that as the starting point for his creation for Godzillasaurus. So a little bit of a small detail there. But anyway, when it comes to special effects, that's probably all I have in my notes that might be relevant to share.
Yeah, and what's great about, of course, Kawakita, bringing in his flavor of how he wants to, because of course the Godzilla suit goes through so many iterations. That's why we all have these collectibles around, and whether it's minor changes in the face or major changes to the entire body, we as fans in a lot of ways are very much embracing that idea of changing it as it goes, because Godzilla, if he looks exactly the same the whole time, that's just one person's design. But yeah, as it goes along, we get to see that change with other other designers. So that is interesting. Going back to the 54 sketches, obviously we're looking at that Godzillasaurus saying, yeah, he is going to become the 54 Godzilla, and then the rest is history, as it were. And but I always found it interesting, of course, that they gave him the Rodan and Gamera roar instead of maybe something along the lines of the original 54 roar or something about that. But I don't know if you want to comment on that. Go on.
I have a story about that. Not that it reveals any information, but it's just something that I remember. I was in Japan in 2014. It was actually the night of the Akira Ifukube 100th anniversary concert with the Tokyo Symphony at the Musa Hall in Kawasaki. And we went afterwards. We had dinner, and I was having a conversation with Mr. Imai, Satoshi Imai, who I'll talk about a little bit later in our show here, who's the conductor of the scores for the Heisei series. And Imai and I were having drinks. He likes to drink, and Brett has seen his behavior when he drinks. He's quite a funny guy. And I was asking, and by the way, Mr. Imai speaks Spanish very well. I speak Spanish somewhat, so that's primarily how Imai and myself communicate. It's actually in Spanish. But I was asking him, we were talking about all the different movies that he had conducted the scores for, and I asked him, I said, do you have any insight into why when the Godzillasaurus is crying in agony, they use the Gamera roar? And he said, they didn't use that roar. I said, no, actually they did. He's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. I was like, yes, it's the roar. You can hear it when he gets shot. He screams like Gamera. He goes, I don't remember that. They didn't do that. Quite clearly, he's wrong. But I just remember he got very adamant that they did not use the Gamera cry. I was hoping that he would have some information about that, because he obviously was in some capacity anyway, a staff member on that film, but he was just denying up and down that it was the Gamera sound. I knew it was, so we moved on to something else, but I tried to get some information about that, but my attempt was not very fruitful.
That's the problem that you'll encounter sometimes, is contradictory information. And when you talk to multiple sources, instead of getting corroboration, which you would normally expect, sometimes if you talk to 3 different people about the same thing, you'll get 3 different answers. That's happened to me before on numerous occasions. But again, that's another illustration of how difficult it is to get confirmation for things, because people will deny things that are plainly obvious. What Erik describes is unfortunately all too common when you're trying to do research among these films. I do have one other comment before we continue. Not really so much about special effects, but more about the concept of Godzilla, since we're talking about design and so forth. Another thing that Omori said, that again, if you want to talk about sort of contradictions, this also goes to that as well. Apparently, Tomoyuki Tanaka told Omori that Godzilla has no blood.
Okay.
No blood. Did Tanaka not produce Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 74? What was his neck in that film? But Gigan, I mean, you go down the list. But according, Tanaka told him, no blood. Godzilla has no blood or veins or arteries.
Interesting.
Not at all. So, because Omori brought this up, and he didn't mention Gigan or Mechagodzilla, he actually mentioned Shin Gojira, because he said that if Tanaka were around, for Shin Gojira, because I guess, a lot of what happens with how they stop Godzilla when they freeze him at the end has to do with the blood and so forth. But then I was thinking, well, just a couple of years later, there's the Yuki Special and Space Godzilla. It's I don't know. I mean, and that to me was just, it opens up so many contradictions, but apparently Omori was very adamant that Tanaka told him, Godzilla doesn't bleed. And so, but again, when Biollante goes through Godzilla's hand, you really don't see any blood come out. You don't really see any spurts or anything else like that. And even when King Ghidorah's neck is tying around Godzilla, it's like foam. You see foam come out, but you don't see blood really. So I don't know. Maybe, apparently that edict had some effect on Omori's films, because you don't see Godzilla bleed in them. But then there's all these other films that Tanaka was involved with where you do see blood from Godzilla, and it just makes you wonder what was going on during that time. But
yeah, the contradiction, goes on even with the translations when they made it to English, and then you actually hear it in Japanese, or you see a subtitled version, and you're saying, oh, that's what happened. And, especially, King Kong versus Godzilla comes to mind. How different of a film that is when you see the subtitled version. But we'll get into our kind of opinions of the film, at the end of this episode. And if you had further stories, of course, Brett, I'm just glad to hear them. But I'd like to get a little bit of music discussion kind of going with Erik, and we have Ifukube being brought back to the Godzilla series after. I guess the Terror of Mechagodzilla being the last time. So in between there, maybe what was going on and maybe what convinced the legendary conductor to come back to the series.
Yeah, indeed. It was in the 1970s when Akira Ifukube, the composer, began to really wind down his activities as a film composer and divert his energy and attention to being a teacher at the Tokyo College of Music, which is located in Ikebukuro, which is a district of Tokyo. So in the 1970s, he started to really distance himself from composing for films. If you look at his filmography from that decade, it's rather sparse, certainly in comparison to his filmography from the 1950s and the 1960s. And in the 1980s, he composed no film scores at all, zero. At that time, he was solely devoted towards being an instructor. And in fact, at the time, he was the president of the Tokyo College of Music, which was, and still is, the most prestigious musical school in all of Japan. So at this time, he's primarily acting as the president of the school, acting as an instructor. And we get to the early 1990s, and he is coaxed out of retirement from scoring films. There's a director who is doing a film. The Japanese title is Dozoku no Ranjo. And I've had a hell of a time trying to get this title translated into English. It's apparently very hard. It means something like chaos of local customs. Which is that in and of itself is a bizarre, translation, but that shows you how hard it is. But Dozoku no Ranjo. And it was a documentary film that is intended to present the notion that many of Japan's indigenous customs, a lot of facets of Japanese culture are actually imported from the Korean peninsula into Japan. And the director of this film wanted Akira Ifukube to provide the score for this documentary film. Ifukube must have found something interesting about the film to come out of retirement to score it. It's very interesting because the composer himself thought that the premise of the documentary was nonsense. Ifukube was very much a nationalist, and he thought it was a ridiculous idea that Japanese culture could have in any way been significantly influenced by Korea. Disagreed with this notion, but said, okay, I'll score the film. So when he wrote the score to the film, he decided, though, that although he was writing the score, when the time came to record it, he didn't want to actually conduct it. So he was still at the Tokyo College of Music and asked one of his students, do you know anybody who is a good conductor? And the name Satoshi Imai came to Ifukube's attention. This is someone who is studying conducting here at the college. He would be a good person to conduct the recording session for this film. So Ifukube met with Mr. Imai. Apparently they hit it off very well, and Ifukube asked Imai to actually conduct a soundtrack recording of the Dozoku no Ranjo score. So that's how Mr. Imai got involved in the first place with Mr. Ifukube. I had my friend, and you both know her, Reiko Yamada, contact Mr. Imai to get some information about this. So she was very nice to get in touch with him, and these were the answers that he provided. He said that he recalled that he scored Dozoku no Ranjo at what was at the time the most technologically adept recording studio in all Japan, had a little monitor to watch scenes of the film, and conducted to that. Well, not long after the completion of this film, Toho makes Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. And Brett actually knows this better because Amori, was it Amori that personally asked Yves Kube to score the film?
Just give me a second. I'll try to.
Okay, because I recall, and I should have read up on it. It's in the interview you did with him, but there's that famous story. I think it might be from a David Milner interview where Yves Kube's daughter was said to have said, the Toho will continue to use your music no matter if you're composing for the films or not. So why don't you just do the next movie yourself? So he said, okay, I'll do it. So he agreed to score Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. I should bring up that, and I've mentioned this before in other interviews, among all the types of films that Mr. Kube liked to score, he liked scoring kaiju films more than anything else, more than samurai films, more than historical drama, more than anything. He loved monsters. And in fact, Godzilla was his first favorite monster, but King Ghidorah was his second favorite. And I know that because in 2016, last year, I was having lunch with the late composer's son in Tokyo, and I was asking him all various types of questions. And I said, well, I know that Godzilla was your father's favorite monster, but who did he like second? And without much hesitation, he said, he very much liked King Ghidorah. So I have to imagine that maybe because this film had two of his favorite monsters from his favorite genre that he liked to score, that this was very, very enticing for him to come back. So he wrote the score, and there's another composer, Sei Ikeno. Sei Ikeno was the composer of The Secret of the Telegion. Am I correct, Brett?
Yes, you are correct about that.
So Sei Ikeno, his real claim to fame in the tokusatsu genre is The Secret of the Telegion. And Ikeno was a student of Yves Kube back in the 1950s. And when Yves Kube was scoring the first Godzilla film in 1954 and created the technique of taking the gloves covered in pine tar and rubbing them against the E string of the contrabass to create Godzilla's roar, it's actually the composer Sei Ikeno who is pulling the string to give a little Ed Wood reference in there, who's actually pulling the string to make Godzilla's roar. And all throughout that time period, Sei Ikeno helped Yves Kube hand copy all of the parts for the orchestra, because back in those days they didn't have copy machines. So Ikeno was Yves Kube's assistant. The night before the recording session for Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Sei Ikeno was over at Yves Kube's house in Oyamadai, Setagaya, stayed up all night hand copying all the parts, violin part, trombone part for all the different members of the orchestra. So Mr. Imai recalls that they show up at the recording studio at Toho, and Yves Kube insisted that during the recording session, images, scenes of the monsters fighting be projected on a large screen in the recording studio. And this had been Yves Kube's habit ever since 1954. From 1954 all throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, he always insisted on having actual monster scenes projected in the recording studio, because he thought the images of the monsters wreaking havoc and fighting would make the performances of the orchestra more aggressive. You might thought it was sort of a strange idea, but he went along with it. And Imai said that so he's conducting the recording session, and the images are being projected in the recording studio, and he found it very hard to keep the attention of the musicians, because instead of watching the baton to keep the tempo, they kept looking back at the screen, and they were laughing, and they were just playing and fascinated by what was going on behind them on the screen as opposed to what was in front of them. And he said it was sort of like a chaos, that they weren't looking at him, they were looking at Godzilla. And so he was frustrated. But eventually they worked it out, and the recording session happened. And Imai went on to be the conductor for the remainder of the Heisei films that Ifukube scored. So Godzilla vs. Mothra, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, and Godzilla vs. Destroyer. And Mr. Imai went on to be one of the composer's closest assistants, confidants. With the composer no longer with us, there are probably two people that are probably the closest that we have to the late composer. One of them is Mr. Imai, and the other is a fellow, Mr. Nagase, who was the composer's secretary at the Tokyo College of Music. Just one more thing I'll say is that I don't have a copy of the Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah score, but I do have a copy, for example, of Symphonic Fantasia No. 1, which was composed in 1983. As far as the orchestration, how he wrote for the instruments for this film as well as the subsequent Heisei films, and John DeSantis is the one who's really picked up on this, is that all of the instrumentation that Ifukube used for the Heisei films basically is reproduction of what he did for the symphonic fantasias. So, his general orchestration, a piccolo, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, an English horn, 2 fagotti in Italian, bassoon. The strings and everything is basically his instrumental recipe that he used for the Heisei films, basically just adapted from what he had put together from the symphonic fantasias. In terms of the quality of the score, I'll finish up my remarks just in a moment. I actually think that among the Heisei scores, the Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah score is the weakest. I have the impression that he composed it in with not a lot of time. There's a lot of repetition in the score, and there's also quite a bit of recycled material from other films in it. If you listen to Mothra, Mechagodzilla, Destroyer, there's a lot more variety, a lot more richness to the overall musical content. Here it tends to be very repetitive, so I don't know quite for certain. I'll research this at some point, but I have the impression that the score was composed very, very quickly. Of course, he recycles King Ghidorah's theme from the original Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, the Godzilla theme, even the scene where King Ghidorah is engaging the fighter jets is from a similar scene in Rodan. It's exactly the same music. When Rodan is flying and battling with the jets, it's that same march music. So it's a good score. There's some very memorable moments in it. I think the way that King Ghidorah's theme is recorded sounds much richer, obviously, from when it did in the 60s from Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. The orchestra is bigger, the recording technology is better. But I actually feel that it's, of the Heisei scores, his weakest.
Yeah, I see Brett grinning a little bit while you're saying that. I'm not sure exactly if he has a comment about that or.
I do. I actually think that King Ghidorah, it's right up there with probably Mothra, but I'd say it's one of his better scores of the Heisei era. And I'd say Destroyer is easily his worst of the Heisei era. Easily, it's not even a contest.
Well, and I think that's one of his best. In fact, going back to Mr. Imai, the conductor, when I talked to him on several occasions about this, I said, "What of the scores that you conducted, which do you think is the best?" And always very immediately he says Destroyer. He thinks that's the best one.
You talk about how Ifukube repurposed a lot of his old scores and a lot of his old cues for King Ghidorah, but you look at the fact that this is the most emotional scene in Destroyer is when Godzilla blows apart, and he repurposed music for that scene as well.
Well, he did, and it's a valid criticism against the composer that, especially in his film scores, there's a lot of recycling that happens. I guess he wanted his musical carbon footprint to be as small as possible, so he was very well engaged in recycling. I think that generally during the Heisei period, he had much more restrictive schedules than he did during the Showa period. there's a lot of lore that he composed the score for the original '54 Godzilla in a week without seeing any footage. Well, that's just false. He saw plenty of footage, and he had around about 2 months to compose that score. I think that in the 1990s, during the Heisei period, Toho was different, and the amount of pressure that was on him was different. It was a completely different studio from what it had been previously, and I think that has a lot to do with it. But notwithstanding, I still feel that there is a greater amount of richness and variety in the other Heisei scores than this one. Having said that, though, I mean, it's still a very good score. I mean, there's many great memorable moments, like, for example, and a lot of things that he does in this score that he would often do in his earlier film scores, like, little details like the use of a vibraphone. Vibraphone is a percussion instrument that he never used in any of his concert music, but he used quite a bit in his film scores, and in particular in his science fiction film scores. So he brings back the vibraphone. You hear that very saliently, if that's a word, in the scene where M11 is chasing Terasawa in the truck. You hear that the vibraphone there. So that's an instrumental touch right out of his old scores. And a very interesting thing is the music during the Dorats. I don't know if a lot of people notice this, but it's a little piano. It's a very almost music box like piano incarnation of the King Ghidorah theme. So it prefigures that the Dorats, speaking of them, will become King Ghidorah. And one of my favorite musical moments from the entire film is actually when you see Godzilla come out of the water and you hear that glissando on the harp. It's sort of an ironic moment because the glissando on the harp, it sounds very sort of angelic, and it's very beautiful, and it's very elegant. And you hear it as Godzilla is rising out of the ocean, and it seems very sort of, for lack of a better word, but to use a musical term, dissonant, that you've got this sort of mighty, horrific monster coming out of the water with this very sort of angelic, elegant harp glissando. And you would think that that the two wouldn't match up very well, but it's for some reason it's a very beautiful, powerful moment. It works very well, and that's that moment with the harp.
That is one of the moments.
But one of my favorite.
That is one of the moments that stands out, actually, because it is so almost out of place. And just a minute ago, of course, not trying to cause a Homenick brotherly feud here, between the two musical scores, Destroyer versus King Ghidorah. I kind of find myself being critical on certain films, scores, visual effects, what have you, but then I look back on how often I might rewatch and re-listen to certain things, and I can actually track that, of course, with iTunes and all that. How many times I've listened to the Destroyer theme, for instance, especially the ending credits. That's one I just find myself listening to quite a bit, actually, and certain tracks throughout. And even this film by itself, we might say it's kind of got a mixed bag of silliness, sci-fi, monster action, just a little bit of time travel. It's got it all, and you sometimes scratch your head and say, is this and even the science being of things being thrown out the door. Just relax and enjoy.
Suspension of disbelief.
Yes, and relax and just enjoy. And I find myself so entertained by this film that it's one that I do find myself watching over and over and over again, actually, maybe more than certain ones of the Heisei series. I might regard another one as my favorite, but I do find myself watching this one an awful lot, actually. So, and also, before I transition away from music into kind of our reaction to the films, thank you very much to Reiko Yamada for making that connection and providing that information. She's just a valuable asset on the legendary composer, and many other, music, being a great performer. I have one of her CDs she was gracious enough to hand me, and it was just it was just a pleasure to meet her actually at the G Fest, where she and you were on my panel actually before the Symphonic Fury concert, and yeah, the information she had was just wonderful, and she's just an amazing person. But yeah, let's talk about kind of our reactions to this film. Do the brothers Homenick have any stories about their first viewing of this film that might be interesting?
Well, I guess I have to start with that because, as I've learned just before we started recording, I have a much clearer memory of the sequence of events than the older brother of the two. I remember it clear as a bell, almost as if it happened yesterday. This was right before Christmas in 1994, and we were at a bookstore. And out of nowhere, my brother comes up to me with a copy of Film Facts magazine. And on the cover of Film Facts was Abbott and Costello Go to Mars. So if anyone wants to go back to 1994 and look up that issue of Film Facts, this is the pivotal one that changed everything, and I'll go into why. What was in this magazine was an ad for a I don't know if I should say the company. It's not around anymore. This is going back over 20 years. I guess I'll say it, Videos of Doom. I won't name the proprietor in case the FBI is watching this and they still want to pursue charges against him. We should pursue charges against him, but I'll get to that in a moment as well. It was a bootleg company, a mail-order bootleg company, and this is the first time we had even heard of anything like this. Because we grew up as Godzilla fans in the 1980s, and we bought anything and everything that was available on VHS at the time. Our holy grail that we could never find was Destroy All Monsters. And we looked everywhere for this movie, and we just never could find it. And I remember during those days when we get the TV guide, you'd look up, I'd always go to D, the D listings, and I'd always look up every week Destroy All Monsters. Never saw it. And I'd always look up F for Frankenstein Conquers the World. Earlier that year on TNT, it finally showed, and I finally got to see Frankenstein Conquers the World in 1994. But it didn't really lead to anything. It didn't really lead to a big renaissance, as you could say, in terms of my interest in the film. And actually, we'd seen Godzilla vs. Biollante for the first time in 1993 when that broadcast on HBO.
I think it was Showtime.
Yes.
I think.
It was Showtime? Okay.
Yeah.
And our father, who subscribed to all those channels, recorded it for us. And this happened right before we went to visit him in that summer. And so the first night in, we watched the first half of Biollante. And then the next morning, we finished the rest of it. But that afternoon, we went to see a movie that kind of made me forget all about Godzilla for a long time. Do you remember what that movie was, Eric?
Jurassic Park.
Jurassic Park. So now I'm looking at a T-Rex that, to me, as a 12-year-old, looks completely real. And I'm just mesmerized. And do you remember how many times I went to see Jurassic Park in the theater?
Well, it was a lot.
7 times. I've never done that even close. No Country for Old Men, I've seen that twice theatrically in its first run.
I saw Godzilla 2007 times. Not
Oh my God.
in the theater.
This was enough.
But anyway.
I remember Eric asked me, how many times did you see Godzilla 2000 in the theater? And I told him once. He was like, really? It's like, it's a terrible movie. Why would
I saw it 7 times because I thought, when am I going to get to see a Godzilla movie on the big screen? By about time 7, I was the only one in the theater. I would be the only one there.
So anyway, after Biollante, at least for me, I don't know about Eric, but Jurassic Park kind of put Godzilla on hold, and I forgot all about Godzilla, and Biollante didn't really have much of an effect on me. But now we're in December '94, and Jurassic Park was sort of it got it out of my system, and I forgot all about dinosaurs, and I forgot about the movie. And so he brought the magazine with the ad for this bootleg company that had not only Destroy All Monsters, but also had all the Heisei era movies up to that point, which would have been Mechagodzilla 93. Space Godzilla at this time, I'm not even sure if it had been released in Japan at the time. So we sent away for it. We got Destroy All Monsters and King Ghidorah first. That was the first batch. Later on, we got Mothra and Mechagodzilla. And so this really changed everything for us because it really reignited the passion for these films that we essentially lost maybe at the very end of the 80s or in the very beginning of the 90s. After, we couldn't find Destroy All Monsters, there was really nowhere else we could go with the genre. It was just too obscure to find anything else. And so I remember I went out and I bought all the Godzilla movies on VHS all over again, built up my collection. After that, we discovered that there was a Johann Plaza near our house in San Diego at the time, and so we bought some Japanese books there, and I found more, bootleg companies. Basically, we were able to order more movies, and it really changed everything. And I want to ask Erik something because we haven't even talked about this ever, and I just sort of want to gauge his reaction. I want to know if he remembers this at all. Do you remember a TV show called I'm Telling? I'm Telling.
I think maybe.
Because on the Family Channel at around this time, there was a kids game show. It first broadcast in syndication in 1987. It's called I'm Telling, and it's about it's a game show with young brothers, young sisters, and they kind of they tell secrets about their siblings, and that's sort of the point of the show. And during the point when they need the sibling to go away, there's a beam effect that comes down. So like in Star Trek, a beam will come down, and then when the beam goes back up, the sibling is gone. And of course, there's a lot of beam effects in King Ghidorah like that, where people get beamed down and beamed up. And I remember at one point, Erik, because I was watching I'm Telling at the time. One of the reasons I was fascinated by it is because the host looked like my environmental studies teacher, almost to a T. But I remember we're watching this movie, and Erik turns to me and he says, "Hey, those beam effects are a lot better than I'm Telling, right?" Yeah. Yeah, they're a lot better than this old 1987, syndicated TV game show, for kids, But he was almost like, hey, they're better than what you see in I'm Telling, right? Those special effects, they're really high tech, So that was one of my favorite memories. I've never forgotten that. For some reason, that's always amused me that he was comparing Kawakita's special effects to this old I'm Telling game show.
And I want to ask, actually, before we forget about these bootleg copies, were they internationally dubbed or were they subtitled into English?
The Destroy Monsters was the AIP dub that everyone likes and is familiar with.
Yeah.
So we saw that from the get-go. So for us, that's Destroy All Monsters. There's really no other version for us. But the Heisei era movies were subtitled.
Okay.
Yeah.
The quality of the videotapes wasn't that good. Sometimes images would break apart, and of course they looked like they were probably fifth generation movies. But you could still see what was going on. You could still follow the action. So, with those bootlegs that we got at least of those crop of films, we could follow the story very easily.
And I kind of figured that they would be subtitled just because the move to make the international releases just hadn't happened yet. So, but yeah, being able to see Mecha King Ghidorah, of course, before yes, all of the rest of us were seeing it, and we heard stories about this kind of hybrid between Mechagodzilla and King Ghidorah, and hearing about that and speculating in our heads what that might look like, and kind of what was your reactions when you first saw that on screen?
Well, for me, I remember being really, really blown away by Mecha King Ghidorah. I really loved that movie. In fact, at the time, it was exciting to get Destroy All Monsters too, but at the time I was actually more fascinated by Mecha King Ghidorah or Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah because I really, really liked how Mecha King Ghidorah looked, and I liked that final battle scene. I watched that movie a lot when we had that tape. Yeah, and it's funny because nowadays I consider it to be perhaps in my adulthood, perhaps the weakest of all of the Heisei films, in terms of some of the special effects, musically speaking. And it's not to say that that's a terrible film. It's not to say that I hate it. I don't. But I certainly, well, it's better than Space Godzilla. I forgot about Space Godzilla for a second, and perhaps that says a lot that I had forgotten even that movie existed. But yeah, I remember being as a youngster thinking that movie was just terrific, and over time my opinions have gone down. One thing that I find completely, how could they have done this, is that Tsuchiya's character, Shindo, looks exactly the same in World War II as he does in the 1990s, except for some gray hair. I think this was a terrible mistake to cast the same, because if you think about it, Tsuchiya is in Seven Samurai in 1954. He should have looked 10 years younger than he looked in that film during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And also Koichi Ueda's character, same thing. I really feel that is a terribly, terribly bad mistake. They should have cast much younger actors to have played those characters instead of using the same actors and then just sort of like artificially graying their hair. That is something that has just always annoyed the hell out of me. But having said that, Tsuchiya is great in the film. The scene where he and Godzilla are staring at each other, and then Godzilla, that great overhead shot where you see Shindo, Godzilla, and then the beam kind of comes in and doesn't quite overtake him at first, but then it just sort of fills the screen with the light. I think is one of the best moments in all of the Heisei series, actually. I think that scene was, from an acting standpoint, musical standpoint, Ifukube's music during that scene is great, and also Kawakida's special effects all comes together rather perfectly in that scene.
Well, I will say that one reason that they probably didn't recast Ueda and Tsuchiya with younger actors is you'd probably lose their performances, which are key. Certainly in the scene where they're saluting Godzilla, even though it's wordless and you just see their faces, you can do a lot with your face if you're a trained and, accomplished actor. And I think they didn't want to lose, the idea is to put Tsuchiya on screen as much as possible.
Yes, I
when
understand.
you've got an actor that excellent, why would you cast some young guy who doesn't know what he's doing to play the master? Just put the master in there, and just let the chips fall where they may. I will say, in terms of people's reaction to it, it is Megumi Odaka's favorite movie of hers from the Heisei series. She says that this is her favorite of all the Heisei movies she was in. And even Koichi Ueda, who Eric mentioned before, he plays the Lagos Island survivor, the crazy dinosaur guy, who's speaking through the bullhorn and he's yelling about dinosaurs and so forth. He was in every movie between Biollante and Final Wars. I had a chance to ask him earlier this year what was his favorite Godzilla movie that he was in. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. He named this one as well as his favorite Godzilla movie. So among the people who made it, it is very well liked. They certainly enjoy the time travel aspects, even though that sort of created a lot of sort of continuity questions. And as a matter of fact, I wanted to mention this earlier in the Fukube discussion. I did have a chance to re-look at my interview with Omori, and he doesn't mention, from what I was able to gather, who hired him or who asked him to join the production. But he did mention a story about how Omori deleted a scene where they were sort of explaining sort of the logic of the time travel about, if someone goes back into the past, then, something in the future must change. There was some sort of conversation about the logic of time travel that Omori deleted from the story. And then Fukube noticed that, perhaps during the rushes or perhaps during scoring, and he said, "Why did you take that scene out? It was perfect the way it was." And Omori was so surprised by this that, in a good way, that like the composer was taking such an interest in the actual quality of the film that he wasn't just collecting a paycheck or he wasn't just providing music, but that he was also very concerned with the quality of the movie itself. And so he was very impressed by that.
No, that's and that just goes to show what kind of a composer that he was anyway. I mean, he took the science fiction and kaiju films, this genre, very seriously. He put a lot of research and work into the films, even if he had a limited time schedule. I really think that he did the best that he could with the materials that he had at hand, with the time he had at hand. And again, although I feel that the King Ghidorah score is the weakest because it's the most repetitive, it has maybe a little bit too much of recycled material. It still is a very good score. The King Ghidorah, like I said, the King Ghidorah theme sounds great. I mean, even the that music is very interesting because that's actually music that was recycled from a 1956 ballet that he wrote called Fashan Jarbo, which is a ballet that is based on a legend from Tibetan Buddhism. So even So even he's got an old ballet from the 1950s, recycled in there. But it works great in the film, actually. When you see at the start of the film with the UFO coming, flying over Tokyo, and you hear that music, that ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, it actually works very well. So, I don't want to give the impression that I'm disparaging the score. I'm not. I think that for what it is, it's actually very well done. Before we wrap it up, though, I wanted to actually make sure that Brett gets this in here about a story that has to do with there's sort of been a story that's been out there in the fandom for quite some time about the origins. Speaking of Kazuki Omori and the origins of scripts and stories about where Omori had gotten the initial idea for Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. There's sort of a story out there about a person, a guy, Mariner Tucker, who was quite well known some years ago, was a very important name in the fandom, had met Omori and actually had met many of the filmmakers. His book, Age of the Gods, is very much a groundbreaking piece of literature on the topic of kaiju and tokusatsu films. But Brett, you've met Omori several times and you've gotten to know him fairly well. This story that Omori stole the script, the idea for the script from Guy Tucker is a little bit of a falsehood, and it's been circulating out there for many years. You have some insight onto Omori's side of the story, and I'd love to hear what Omori has to say about that.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that if you make an accusation like this, and if you say that you submitted a script, whether it's to Toho or to anyone, I think at a minimum you should be able to produce the document. I mean, if you wrote it and you submitted it, why don't you show a copy? And even though he's repeated the story at conventions, particularly G-Con 96, which you can actually find on YouTube if anyone wants to throw that into their YouTube machine and look it up, they can see in Guy Tucker's own words what he says on the subject. But he didn't produce any script, and that to me is quite suspect, because no one can really judge the merits of what he's saying unless you produce a document, which to my knowledge he never did. But it is true that I've had a chance to ask Mr. Omori about this, and I actually did it on a couple of occasions. I wanted to do it originally in 2006 when I interviewed him. I wanted to address it in a very indirect way. So I asked him about the origins of the Miki Saigusa character, because that's one of the bones of contention that was brought up. One of the claims that, that was an idea stolen from him. And Omori talked about the idea, it's like Beauty and the Beast. He wanted to have sort of this contrast of Godzilla with this small, young, cute Japanese girl at the time. Just sort of the contrast of the size of this monster and, this young girl. One of his ideas actually was to have Miki use psychic power to elevate Godzilla out of the water in that scene in Osaka where, the psychic power gets so strong that Miki Saigusa actually faints. But Tanaka nixed that idea and said, no way, we're not going to do that. But he also said that, again, and this goes back to Omori's wheelhouse, he drew inspiration from a Western source. Not Guy Tucker, but Stephen King. Carrie, the character of Carrie. That was one of his inspirations for the Miki Saigusa character. So he was, he readily said that, yeah, I took inspiration from another source, but it wasn't that source. I mean, and again, that goes back to, if you look at King Ghidorah, if you look at Biollante, he obviously borrows, beats and images and, even certain characters from other Western movies, which he's a fan of. And he's always admitted that. So that sort of fits the pattern of what we know about him. He's taken things from Terminator. In fact, the idea of time travel in the first place was taken from Back to the Future Part 2. Because when Godzilla vs. Biollante was released in Japan at the time, that was the bigger hit than Biollante. Biollante actually didn't do well at the box office. So Tanaka and Omori kind of got together and they said, well, maybe time travel, that's the thing that people want. Maybe they want to see time travel. So they made the next story time travel due to Back to the Future Part 2. So again, none of this has to do with sort of an unsolicited script from an American teenager, which guy would have been at the time that he submitted it to the contest. He would have been an actual teenager. And then more directly, when I saw Omori in October, I was able to ask him through a translator because obviously, the details were much more than my very limited Japanese could convey. I told the person the situation. I said, could you explain, this is what this individual has said, and I'd like Mr. Omori to respond to it because I think it's important. A lot of people might be under the impression that he stole some of these ideas without credit. And I watched Mr. Omori's reactions, his facial reactions, and it was just, as you can imagine, it was just total shock. Like, really? Like, somebody is saying this? And he said, absolutely not. And he said a psychic character, going out to meet Miki Saigusa, isn't exactly, it's not like like anyone can come up with a psychic character. It's a very common character that you see in many forms of entertainment. So Omori said maybe he did come up with a psychic character. He can't say whether he did or not because obviously he's never seen the script, if there even was a script, and I don't know that there even was a script submitted. We're all in the honor system here. He had the copy of the script, presumably, but he never produced it, even when he was on stage talking about this situation at a convention. So we're all just taking his word for it. But Omori said, yeah, maybe he did. Maybe he did come up with a psychic character, but that's common. Lots of people come up with psychic characters. Stephen King came up with Carrie, for example. And that's, one of the things he cited as an inspiration for Miki Saigusa. But he was just shocked to hear it. He had never heard it before. It was news to him. And just reading his facials, I could tell, that he was hearing it for the first time. And he was just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. And again, whatever you want to say about Omori, he's a very creative guy, and he's got tons of his own ideas. And he's a screenwriter who's written lots of screenplays. He doesn't need to look at other scripts to steal ideas, And in fact, when it came to Biollante, even though there was the story contest, according to Omori, they just took the idea of the DNA, and I think also the idea of having a plant monster, and then everything else came from Omori. Like all the characters, the situation, everything else came from Omori's mind. And again, I believe it because, he's a very interesting person with a lot of ideas, a big imagination, and I just don't see it as he'd be stealing ideas from a teenager. Also, the fact that Omori really doesn't speak English. I don't know how well he reads English. Maybe he can read it a little bit, but I know just in the time that I've spent around him, he's never really said much more than a couple of words at a time. So I just don't see him looking at an English language screenplay, going through it in detail and saying, well, I'm going to take this, I'm going to take this, I'm going to take this, and being able to understand all the details that he's reading. Maybe he can read some things, I don't know. But I know in terms of speaking, I've never heard him say more than a couple of English words. So,
and I think that's important, and it's like I said, it's a story that's been out there. I'm not sure that it's a story that is very well known much anymore. I mean, with the passage of time, perhaps less and less people know about this, but it is out there, and I think it's great that someone like you with boots on the ground in Japan was able to actually meet and talk to these people. You provide you're an excellent conduit through which they can provide their side of the story. So I think that's a very interesting perspective to keep in mind. Omori's perspective, Omori's take on the situation when considering whether or not the script idea was stolen from somebody else.
Yeah, it's a good way to clear up kind of the air when it comes to, like you said earlier, it's easy to get a lot of misinformation, and memory is what it is. It kind of does get clouded as things go by. Denials of certain roars being used, things like that are just par for the course when it comes to a lot of these things. Whether they were, in a lot of ways, you do kind of have to have the documentation of these things. So, and I don't imagine a lot of these films had a lot of what we have in America. If you look at Jurassic Park, how much behind the scenes film work and logging of this information was actually being done. I can't imagine in a lot of ways that same budget was available for these kaiju films, actually. So, we see some publicity stills, we see some behind-the-scenes photographs, but actual behind-the-scenes footage, other than maybe, Godzilla 1984. A lot of us have seen, the behind the scenes because, of course, that's such a big publicity deal with the Cybot, went into that. But this film and other of the Heisei films, we didn't see a lot of that. So you do have to take their testimonials, at their word in a lot of ways. And we have, you guys as valuable sources of information and the people you have interviewed over the time, and that's just really great that you've shared it with us here, and we're gonna close up here in just a few, actually, and I'm gonna give you guys the chance for a last word, but I just want to thank you guys because when I was thinking about bringing both you guys on the show, actually, I said I'm probably going to throw out a few questions and really just listen to what all you have to say, because there's such a wealth of information here that you guys can bring to the table. And I've always, like many of the fans, just digest as much of this information because it's such an interest. There's so many interesting stories out there to be told, and that's why we don't just take the films. We read the books. We listen to the commentaries. And hear all their different contributions that came into making these films what they are, and what compels us and drives us and just keeps us going, and which and creating such a community of fandom, actually. So, with that in mind, actually, was there any other additional stories before we get to our last word here that maybe would be interesting to bring up before we close up?
Yes, I do. And actually, I wanted to circle back to something that I mentioned at the very beginning when I talked about Akiji Kobayashi, who, of course, was the captain in Ultraman and was in Kamen Rider and was in King Ghidorah as well. And he's the person Shindo was talking on the phone when he gets blown away by Godzilla. I had a chance to talk to Megumi Odaka about her memories of him, and she had some kind of fun and interesting stories to tell. He was a very nice guy. According to her, he had a very pure heart. But she was a very shy young woman at the time. And she was a fan of his from a variety TV show that he did in the 80s. And on that TV show, he was called Oyasan. And she knew him as Oyasan, growing up watching him on TV. And she really wanted to call him Oyasan, but never could get the courage to use that name. So it was always, Kobayashi-san, keeping it very formal. But every time she was around him, she just wanted to call him Oyasan, but just never had the courage to do it, even though he was a great guy, very friendly. But in the scene where they're kind of getting lifted off the ground, going into the mothership, Kobayashi is there. And he was actually afraid of heights. So one thing that Megumi Odaka told me is that even though they just went off 5 meters off the ground on this little platform for the scene, when they got back on the ground, his hand was dripping in sweat because he was so nervous about being just 5 meters off the ground in this on this platform. So again, a little bit of a funny story there. One other thing that she told me was about her character arc. Odaka was convinced that this would be her last Godzilla movie because she thought that her character arc, which started in Biollante as a girl, so when you look at her character in Biollante, she looks like a girl. She's wearing girl clothes. She looks very young. When you look at her in King Ghidorah, she's wearing adult clothes. She's grown up. She's become a woman. And Odaka thought that was her character arc. She went from a girl to becoming a woman, and that's it. So when she got the phone call to do Mothra, she was shocked. She was literally surprised, really? You want me back for Mothra? I thought my character was finished. I thought that's as far as we're going to go with it. So she had no idea that she would be brought back, all of these, movies later. She thought it would all end with King Ghidorah after she became a woman, which, of course, again, when you look at her character in that movie, she has matured and really does look like a full-grown adult. And she thought that would be her character arc. So a very, a little interesting thing there. But I think overall, I mean, obviously there's a couple of little things that we can talk about. If anyone would like more information, the full Kazuki Omori interview is on VantagePointInterviews.com. So just throw the name Kazuki Omori into the search button, and you'll be able to find it. You'll be able to pull it up and read all that he has to say about this and other topics. A lot of other interviews are there as well related to this film. So if anyone would like to, look at some other information that's out there, I'd highly recommend that. But I think overall, that's probably all the information that I've got that I really wanted to share today.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that. And actually, real quick about the Odaka, Megumi Odaka's character, Miki Sagusa, her character arc. I do find it interesting how far she did go, all the way to Destroya in the way that they said, as you age, your psychic abilities, going to start drifting away from you, and then the next generation's going to take over from that. So she went from the little girl character just learning her abilities to losing them and becoming part of the military force anyways, and even piloting Mechagodzilla, and having a lot more involvement in that. So she's done it all, actually, and that's what's kind of cool about seeing that character arc through the Heisei series, actually. So any stories about the film that Erik, you would like to share, reactions to it, little interesting tidbits that jump out at you when you think of this film?
Yeah, well, like I said, when I first saw it as a high school student, the bootleg copy, I was really quite obsessed with it. I loved, like I said, I loved the way Godzilla looked. I thought Godzilla looked great in Biollante too. I really liked the way that King Ghidorah looked. I really liked, especially Mecha King Ghidorah. And there's two parts in the movie that always were very impressive to me. When the first battle, when Godzilla, breathes his ray as King Ghidorah is trying to get away, and then he gets all the holes in the wings, and then he's flying over the water, and then he falls, and then the big plume of water. Same thing happens at the very end when Mecha King Ghidorah picks him up, and they're flying, then they fall. I remember thinking that those scenes always looked very impressive. They were shot from above, and then you see them fall into the water in the big impressive plume of water. And I remember years later seeing behind the scenes footage of how they did that, and I remember at the time thinking they were the full suits. But they were actually in this behind the scene footage. They're literally up on a crane over the daipuru, the big pool, just like a handheld camera, and they're small, kind of puppet size. I mean, if I recall, maybe about that big.
Yeah.
And they fall right on cue, and then obviously some water pressure or something comes up. And I remember thinking when I saw those behind the scenes, like, wow, it looks so much bigger on camera. I thought maybe they had used the full suits, and but that's just a testament to the genius of Koichi Kawakita. I mean, when he was inspired, when he had good ideas, and all the stars were aligned. He was able to produce some very memorable special effects images and moments, and for me, that's one of them. I just remember being shocked that those were not full-size suits that were being dropped. But that's all I have to say.
Yes, and and I'll give you guys a last word here in a minute. But Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, two great monsters, of course. I always kind of think of King Ghidorah as Godzilla's arch nemesis. It's Batman's got his Joker, and Superman's got his Lex Luthor. Godzilla has his King Ghidorah, and so that's where when this film comes out, it's just a logical choice, obviously, that Godzilla is going to fight the three-headed monster. And so, this film, of course, very entertaining, especially if you put maybe your mind to the side when it comes to the logic of time travel, of course, and all that we know that Back to the Future told us was important that you don't do with messing with time. If you kind of forget the fact that their goals keep changing as we go with, we got to get rid of Godzilla. Oh no, we got rid of Godzilla, we've got King Ghidorah. We need Godzilla back. we 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 got rid of King Ghidorah with Godzilla. Now he's the problem. Let's bring King Ghidorah back. And it's like, how many times are we going to keep this whole monster on monster action till we finally say, yeah, there's got to be a better solution to this. So all we are doing is reviving monsters. And
Yes.
but us in the audience, of course, we love that. So just keep doing that. That's great. So, but yeah, this film has a lot of those things, those the pseudoscience-y things that Godzilla films sometimes get known for. That we have no problems kind of setting those aside and saying, just enjoy, enjoy all aspects of this film, from visual effects to music to great lines, like you're going to share here in just a minute. But I'm going to thank you guys so much, Erik Homenick, AkiraFukabe.org, Brett Homenick, and VantagePointInterviews.com. Check out both of these sites. More information's out there on the web for you. And what's really great about this is these gentlemen have done this work, and it's out there for us. You don't have to, purchase their books or anything. It's just readily available at your fingertips. So definitely check that out. And I'm definitely going to have you guys on another episode of the Monster Report. So for me, Nick Adam Poling, this has been an episode of the Monster Report, and we will catch you next time. And here's the last word.
What's your last word, Brett?
Godzilla's Revenge.
Okay, my boss.